Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you all. My name is Father David Hollenbach, and I teach here at Georgetown in the School of Foreign Service, and I am also affiliated with the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, working on issues of social justice and peace and refugee issues in particular in my own case. So welcome to being here for this continuing dialogue with our distinguished visitor, Archbishop Silvano Tomasi. We are here this afternoon to discuss a really urgent issue that is facing us in the world today, namely the displacement of refugees and the major movement of migrants in our world. As many of you know, the number of refugees in the world today is at an all-time high. We have some 67+ million displaced people, refugees and internally displaced in our world today, which is the highest number in recent history, certainly the highest since the Second World War. And the number of migrants is also extraordinary. In 2015, the number of migrants, which means those living outside the country of their birth, reached 244 million people. This is the reason why one distinguished author has called our day the age of migration. So we are here to discuss those questions. Also, today, Pope Francis is launching a major initiative from the Catholic community to address these issues of refugees and migration. Today in the Vatican City at midday in his address, he launched what he calls the Share the Journey campaign, a campaign which is meant to be the engagement of the Catholic community and its other collaborating people from Christian and non-Christian denominations, an interfaith initiative that will address this question of migration and refugees in our world, to try to respond to the movement of people, as he said, without fear, the fear that leads to so often excluding those who are different from who we are. Now, migration is, of course, a very old story. It has been happening since the beginning of human history. But the realities of today mean that it has become a particularly urgent sign of the times of the world we're living in today. And in his encyclical letter, Laudato Si, Caring for Our Common Home on environmental questions, Pope Francis wrote, "All it takes is one good person to restore hope." Well, today we have 4 good people here to help us restore hope. And I would like to introduce them to you, and then we'll open it up to their comments and to your comments as well. We want to be very interactive in our discussion this afternoon. I got to know Archbishop Silvano Tomasi through his role in a conference I organized in Boston some years ago on the plight of refugees, where he contributed an outstanding essay on Catholic perspectives on the rights of refugees to the book that conference produced. Today, Archbishop Tomasi serves at the Holy See at the Vatican in the Vatican's Office for Promoting Integral Human Development, which addresses the Church's approach to justice and peace, including justice for migrants and refugees. Formerly, immediately before taking this position he's now in, he served as the permanent observer, or you might say ambassador, of the Holy See to the United Nations offices in Geneva, in particular to where he interacted with the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees in Geneva. And his earlier positions took him to Ethiopia and Eritrea. He worked for a number of years here in the United States with the U.S. Bishops' Conference and their Office on Migration and Refugees. He holds his PhD from Fordham University, where he studied on migration issues. So I know that Archbishop Tomasi is one of the best informed Roman Catholic thinkers about the topic we are going to address today, so we're really privileged to have him with us. Let me introduce our other panelists, and then we'll move directly into our discussion with each other. Dr. Elizabeth Ferris, to my immediate left, is research professor at Georgetown's Institute for the Study of International Migration and a fellow at the Brookings Institution in Foreign Policy. She was, before coming to Georgetown, co-director of the Brookings Institution's project on internal displacement, working with a very distinguished set of colleagues there, including with Francis Mading Deng, a very distinguished Sudanese who was, for a while, the High Commissioner for Prevention of Genocide with the United Nations. Before she came to Brookings and ultimately to Georgetown, she worked at the World Council of Churches as director of their Immigration and Refugee Program, and she also worked with Church World Service in New York. She has been a Fulbright professor at the Universidad Autónoma in Mexico City and has written or edited 6 books, including, most recently, The Consequences of Chaos, Syrian Displacement, and the Failure to Protect. So the reality of the Syrian refugee crisis is very well known to Professor Ferris. Our third panelist is Father Ludovic Lado, who is a member of the Society of Jesus, a Jesuit. He is the visiting Jesuit professor at Georgetown this semester. He is a social anthropologist, originally from Cameroon, now based in Côte d'Ivoire in Abidjan. I had the privilege of teaching him both in Nairobi at Hekima College and in Boston at the Weston Jesuit School of Theology, where I taught for many years, and know that he is an outstanding, not only outstanding student, but outstanding scholar, and a very vigorous activist as well. He has his doctorate in anthropology from Oxford University, and his work on social justice particularly concerns governance in African countries, in particular his indigenous country of Cameroon and other parts of West Africa. He's written a number of books, including Catholicism in West and Central Africa in the 21st century. He's presently at the Center for Research and Action for Peace in Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, and he's now visiting professor here at Georgetown, as I said. Our final panelist is Habon Ali. Habon Ali is a senior here at Georgetown as an undergraduate, doing her bachelor's degree and simultaneously a master's level student in a 5-year BS/MS program in foreign service at the School of Foreign Service, working in regional and comparative studies with a focus on poverty and world economy. And she's also very engaged in the question of the role of women and women's rights. She's been a research assistant to one of our distinguished faculty members who happens to be with us this afternoon, and working on migration in the Horn of Africa. She herself is from Kenya, and where she was born in Garissa in northeast Kenya, up on the border with Somalia, and her family, part of her family, have been refugees from Somalia into Kenya. So she knows from family background the reality of the migration and refugee issue. She is also serving today as an intern with the Jesuit Refugee Service here in Washington, and she is vice president of Georgetown's Muslim Students Association. So we have a very interesting perspective coming from Habon Ali. One other thing before we begin, I would like to just list the sponsors of this event. The Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs is a sponsor, as is the Institute for the Study of International Migration that Beth Ferris is from, the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life, headed up by John Carr, who is here with us, the Center for Social Justice Research, Teaching and Service is a co-sponsor, the Vice President for Global Engagement, the Vice President for Mission and Ministry, and then from off campus, the Jesuit Refugee Service and Catholic Relief Services are all co-sponsoring this event. So we're very grateful for the support of so many groups for our event. So I'm going to begin by asking a couple of questions to our panelists. And I will begin with Archbishop Tomasi. We're not going to have a lot of formal presentations, but we hope to have a lot of give and take, and we'll get you into this discussion fairly quickly, I hope. So, Archbishop Tomasi, let me begin by asking you, today there are more refugees and migrants in the world than at any time since World War II. This is a really serious crisis on our hands today. And you have been working on this question on behalf of the Catholic Church and on behalf of in relation to the United Nations for many years during your time in Geneva and now in Rome. Could you tell us what you see as the major challenges that we face today by the movement of all these refugees and migrants in our world today? How would you describe the chief challenges that we need to face today?
You mentioned that we are in the age of migration, and it's exactly that. And there are some 250 million people living and working in countries different from where they were born. And if we add the internal migrants, we have 1 person in 7 that is a migrant in this world. So it's a huge issue. The fact of having so many people moving across the globe raises a variety of questions, difficult questions. But I would like, for sake of brevity, to point a couple of them. One is that we should frame the problem in the right way. This is the first step. Not to be dominated by emotions or by fear, by the unknown person that comes across the border, but to put the whole question of migration in the proper perspective, looking at the reasons why people move, the policies of the globe community that affect movement of people, and the necessity to accept these people in the context of the common good of the people of the countries of origin and the people of the countries that receive the migrants. And the second point that I would like to look at, that seems to be very crucial today, is how this mobility of the human family affects identities. The identities of the countries that receive the immigrants, and the fear that is generated by the pace of change that this brings about. I would think these two issues deserve to be analyzed more in depth.
Thank you. We will come back to that. Those are both very challenging kinds of issues that we will have an opportunity to pursue in some greater depth. Let me turn now to Professor Elizabeth Ferris. I should tell you, Beth Ferris, played an extremely important role at a major event that took place just a little bit over a year ago In September of 2016, there was a World Summit on Migration and Refugees at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, which brought together heads of state from all over the world, including then President Obama went. And Ban Ki-moon, who was then Secretary General of the United Nations, prepared a working document for that World Summit. It went out under his name, but Beth Ferris wrote it and worked closely with all of these countries around the world to formulate an agenda for the world in regard to refugees and migrants. So I'd like to turn to Beth Ferris and say, in light of your experience of working on the World Summit and what has happened at it and since then, what do you think are the biggest challenges that we face, in particular on the part of the international community and the leading countries of the world like the United States in responding to the refugee and migration movement of today, in light of your experience at the World Summit and related events?
Sure, thanks. And just to talk for a minute about refugees, with part of this much larger movement of people, yes, we have a refugee crisis, but it is not a crisis of numbers. If you take the 65 million, 40 million are internally displaced people with a whole different set of issues that nobody is talking about. But if you look at the other, we now have 25 million refugees, way too many. But in terms of an increase over recent years, it's 2 or 3 million. In a world of 7 billion people, this is not a crisis. 1.5 million refugees arriving in Europe in 2015 in a region with 650 million people is not a crisis of numbers. What it is a crisis of a failure of our system, our global system of collective response. And that system is failing badly. You know, this whole fragile refugee framework, legal conventions and so on, developed after World War II, was based on the notion of the common good. It is the collective responsibility to respond when refugees flee terrible situations, not just the responsibility of the countries to which they happen to arrive. You know, when 450,000 Rohingya refugees arrive in Bangladesh in the last month, it shouldn't just be the responsibility of Bangladesh. We all have an interest in setting up systems that respond equitably, fairly, effectively, and not leaving it to the country. So I think we've got a crisis, but it's really a crisis of a system. And frankly, I think it's going to be a very hard sell to get countries of the world, including our own government, to see the collective nature and to see the leadership role that's desperately needed.
Thank you, yes. And you could say that it's a crisis of sharing the burden of how to bear to help those who are in need. It's not just immediate response to the refugees, but how do we get the nations of the world to work together to respond to this crisis? Thank you. We'll come back to that as well. Let me turn now to Ludovic Lado for perhaps a more African perspective to this issue. And also, Lado is an anthropologist and knows a lot about the cultural dimensions of the movement of people and so forth. So perhaps, Lado, you could say a few words to us about how you see the movement of people in Africa that are moving. There are many people moving from Cote d'Ivoire and other parts of West Africa up through Libya and trying to reach across the Mediterranean. It's partly because of issues in their home country, but there are both push factors and pull factors. Perhaps you could give us a little illumination about the African component about this from your standpoint in Abidjan, in Cote d'Ivoire, or your broader African perspective.
Well, if we are looking at the West African perspective, which could apply broadly to African perspective, I would say West Africa has, of course, as you just mentioned, a long tradition of human mobility. And as such, it is not a problem. Originally, it's not a problem. But of course, if you take into account colonial boundaries, it becomes a problem. And from the African perspective, the migration and refugee issue, I mean, we have to deal with it at least on two fronts. One is a South-South perspective, because actually the number of people moving South-South, I mean, within Africa is far bigger than those trying to get to Europe. So we are, that's the first front. And there, of course, you have people who are moving because they want to move, and those who are moving because of some involuntary reasons, and these are mainly refugees or labor migrants. And West Africa has a very long tradition of migration for labor reasons. And of course, you have the other front, which is those who are kind of trying to flee, to escape from the difficulties, or mainly economic difficulties they are facing in the context of Africa. And most of the time, these difficulties are related to governance issues. And so, as far as, I mean, as I see it, if we deal correctly with the issue of governance in Africa, there will surely be less people wanting to come to the West. And I've lived in Côte d'Ivoire for the past 5 years, and of course, Côte d'Ivoire is today one of the main sources of young people taking risk, terrible risks to trying to reach Europe, and so it is a major concern, given the demographics of Africa. The big majority of populations, I mean, it's very young. And of course, the question is, the major question beside the governance issue is, what do you do with these young people? Unless we address that, there will always be people trying or taking risk to kind of get to where they feel that there are better living conditions. And finally, this is obviously an international issue, but it also have local implications, because, of course, if, again, you take the case of Côte d'Ivoire, they had a almost 10-year crisis from 2002 to 2011. And this crisis was basically rooted in issues of belonging. I mean, who is Ivorian, who is not Ivorian? And those whose citizenship, I mean, was being questioned are migrants who came in from Burkina Faso, and they have been there for generations. And so here comes a bunch of politicians, and they are seeking electoral support, and they bring up these issues. You are not Ivorian, and this leads to a number of, to migration crisis, to identity crisis, and as the Archbishop was mentioning, so it is a multi-layered issue, and again, Africa is dealing with it on both fronts. I mean, South-South and then South-North.
Good, thank you. I mean, we'll come back. This brings up the identity question in a very real way, which the Archbishop raised, and is a very important question, which leads to these questions of fear and resistance and so forth. So let me turn then to Habon Ali, who was our student panelist this afternoon. As a student at Georgetown, Habon, and as a person who comes from a Muslim background and from a family that has had experience of being migrant, and also some of your family being refugees coming from Somalia into Kenya, and as being a younger person who could be someone who is having a vision of where this can go for the future. Would you want to say something that could be of help to, from your point of view as a student here at Georgetown, on what this issue looks like to you as a Georgetown student, and what kind of responses you think might be particularly useful for us to talk about from your point of view as a student here?
Okay. From my point of view as a student, I would say that in addition to just the crisis of refugees, there's a crisis of perception. And I think that, as the Archbishop mentioned, there's that notion of fear, and that drives policy, that drives people's understanding of refugees and immigrants who come to this nation. And I think that that's where the discussion lies, and that's where the need to kind of interact with these immigrant communities and interact with these refugee communities who majority of the time end up living in siloed portions of metropolitan area. So I would assume that that's where, you know, the engagement process is necessary.
So you would recommend the need for engagement,
Yes.
for people to actually
Yes.
get to know some
Yes.
refugees or
Yes.
some new people who have come in as migrants recently. And my experience, and I think there's some data sociologically to show this also, that getting to know a refugee is one of the biggest steps toward having a greater degree of openness toward people coming and recognizing that these people are not such serious threats. And that's related to the identity question. And
Exactly.
you experience that through your own interaction with students here at Georgetown. Do you think that that's happens for them?
I think that many students of Georgetown, you know, they come from middle to upper middle class and affluent families. So for them, their first time interacting with someone who's an immigrant or someone who comes from a refugee background it's intensive. For them, they can't comprehend the things that those students have gone through. For example, DACA students, I know we're going to discuss that another time as well, but you know, like really truly trying to not only empathize, but not just sympathizing, but also empathizing, really trying to understand what are the struggles that these students go through when they're at this university, what are the difficulties that they face, what are the obligations that they have that you don't necessarily have. And I think that for many students at Georgetown, they can't really wrap their heads around why certain students have to work 2 jobs, or why they have to have this family obligation and you know, actually even send home money home as well. So for them, they really just, it's that dichotomy. They just can't get themselves to really see that certain type of lifestyle.
It's a very experiential reality that helps people realize where this situation has a direction that could lead to some solutions. Let me turn to another dimension of the issue that we're here to discuss today, since today Pope Francis is launching this Share the Journey campaign, in which he is calling upon the resources of the Christian tradition to address the question of refugees. We just heard from Habon how experience of interaction with refugees and migrants can be a source for this, but also the Pope is trying to advocate that religious ideas and traditions shaped by religion, Christianity in particular, but I know from my own work that you can look at the Islamic tradition and see that it contains many sources of openness toward those who are migrants, and the Jewish tradition. In fact, you look at the 3 great monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all 3 of them have as among their founding moments a moment of migration, whether it's the Jewish Exodus or the Christian reality of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph being driven as refugees to Egypt shortly after Jesus' birth, or in the case of Muhammad, the Hijra, his movement from Mecca to Medina as a migrant. These are founding moments in our religious traditions. So perhaps we could turn to ways in which religion can play some role in responding to this. Archbishop Tomasa, you have been involved in looking at the contribution of the Catholic community to this for many years. Would you say some things to help us see what you think the Christian community in particular, and perhaps the Catholic community in a special way, can make as a contribution to the challenge of solidarity and the collaboration that we need for response to the problems we face on refugees and migrants today?
Maybe I can start with premise that migration is not a new phenomenon. Although we talk so much about it now in the past few years, the headlines in the newspapers are filled with comments one way or the other about the movement of people. Migration is a natural phenomenon in history that has served to create civilizations, and it will continue. That's the other part. It's not an emergency. The phenomenon of migration will continue if we look at the demographic imbalances around the world. So this said, from the Catholic tradition, I think the campaign that Pope Francis wants to, that has been launching today, is to add what I could call an ethical, theological dimension to the debate. Not just economic or sociological reasons, but there is a previous reasoning that has to be carried out, and that is to see why, in the wider context of life, these people move and what their reasons, what the justification they may have. By raising the level of the debate to an ethical and theological debate, it shows the wrong approach the most political leaders have taken in the recent 3 or 4 years, 5 years, in manipulating movement of people for political objectives. So the ethical theological dimension eliminates this reasoning. And on the other hand, it gives a new dimension to globalization. It shows that globalization is a phenomenon that, first of all, besides communication, besides ease of travel and all that, it's a phenomenon of movement of people, and leads us back to the fundamental point that before borders were created, the family of God was one. And this generates an obligation of solidarity. So the campaign that is begun today is to tell people, look, analyze migration in a proper context. Don't build up a wrong objective by creating fear, or by saying that this is new, that this is an exceptional moment. We need to redimension the whole debate and read it in the context of a more realistic approach that comes from an ethical and Christian perspective.
Thank you. Beth Ferris, you worked for many years with the World Council on these Council of Churches, and coming from a Protestant Christian tradition and working in an interfaith context for many years on bringing dialogue between religious communities and the migration community and the refugee support community. Can you say anything that you think